This is 1996, this is game one, the setting is Philadelphia, and Garry Kasparov is, without question, the greatest chess player who had ever lived up until that moment. Now, the computers back then used brute force computation, which is different than today's machine learning, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. Garry responds with the Sicilian defense, and we have the move c3. Which is a move. Clearly, Deep Blue was familiar with the Gotham Chess YouTube video on the Alpine Sicilian, which was 24 years into the future. And the idea is that basically you want to play d4. Now, Garry is no slouch. He responds with the most critical move, d5. Normally, it's not considered recommended to put queens out early unless you're playing the Scandinavian defense or unless you're a beginner looking to get a scholar's mate. But white no longer can play knight to c3 because you cannot capture your own pieces. There you go, you learned something today. So white plays d4, black plays knight f6, white develops the knight, and after bishop g4, bishop e2, nowadays it's actually very trendy to drop the knight out to a3, because you're trying to go to b5 and sneak into the c7 square. But this is 1996, so first of all, Gotham Chess is a baby and is 1 year old, and the computer doesn't know about knight a3. So we have e6, h3, the bishop retreats, and white castles. Garry continues with his development. So far, so good. Everything is more or less normal. Here we have bishop to e3 developing, the dark squared bishop, and Garry should probably finish developing and choose which way to castle, but first he decides to take in the center, take, and plays this interesting move, bishop b4. Now, bishop b4 is an instigating kind of move. Essentially, you are really begging for this move a3 to be played, but you're basically saying, hey man, if you develop your knight, I'm going to laser beam it, and also I can't get in the way of my queen. Like, I need my queen to be able to drop back. And bishop e7 is a little bit too passive. So the computer develops the knight to c3. We have queen back, and now the computer decides to chase. Oh, Garry goes back to e7. We have knight to e5. Essentially challenging Garry in a tactical fashion, saying, hey, you haven't castled yet, so now you've got some problems to deal with. What are you going to do with your knight? What are you going to do with your bishop? Garry decides to take on e2 first. We have queen taking back, and he decides to castle. All right, so far so good. We are now officially in the middle game. Some pawns have been traded, some pieces have been traded. Who is going to win? Rook to c1 by Deep Blue, obviously. Activating the rook, putting some pressure on this knight, making this knight make a decision. If you take on e5, what ends up happening is I now attack your knight, forcing it to move, but in a worse turn of events, my rook and my bishop team up on the same square, and bishop c5 is a major threat. But furthermore, if you drop the knight back guarding that, then I actually team up with my knight. It's very good to see what your pieces coordinate on together. And white would simply take this pawn, as stupid as it looks, and it looks like you're going to trap my bishop, well, then I'm just going to bring in my rook. So this that wasn't what ended the game, but that is why the move rook c1 is so strong, putting some pressure on the knight, and Garry has to bring his rook and defend the knight. So now the computer mobilizes again. It's now put three of its major, well, they're called minor pieces, knights and bishops, but it's kind of activated its three most useful pieces right now in the most aggressive of fashions. We have bishop to b6, hitting the pawn on d4, and the computer takes on f6. Realizing that if Garry takes back with the queen, he would blunder knight d7, hitting these two, so now Garry is forced to damage the structure in front of his king, and damage the structure of the pawns on the queen side. So now Gary's got doubled f pawns, and Gary's got doubled b pawns, but the computer has a weak pawn on d4, an isolated pawn, which could be a weakness if enough pieces get traded. Computer plays rook to d1, now f5, clamping, taking a little bit more space, activating the queen, fighting for the center, queen e3, queen f6, and here the computer plays a very nice idea, d5, striking in the center and immediately showcasing why those weaknesses on the queen side are, well, called weaknesses. There is literally nobody guarding them. It's not like they're just standing around and they could potentially be targets. The fact that you can take on b6 and then taking on b7. So, we have rook takes d5, a trade, and here the computer plays a surprising move. It doesn't immediately cash in on its investment. Instead, it plays the move b3, getting the pawn out of the way, and now we have king to h8, we have queen takes b6, rook g8, Garry begins counterattacking measures, but the computer's coming back. It's going to start picking apart all the weaknesses here on the queen side. d4, the knight jumps into d6, and the pawn on f5 is under pressure. Apparently d4 was a mistake. Garry had to play rook d8. Stodgy defense, it's ugly but it does the job. d4, and because he tries to create too active of counterplay, the computer basically calls his bluff. Says knight takes b7, Garry. What are you going to do about this knight? Knight to e5, queen d5. And now I monitor your pawn coming forward. I've got pressure here. Very bad situation for Gary to be in. Tries to play knight to d3, attacking the rook, but the rook moves to c7. That was the other idea of moving the queen out of the way, is you can go rook c7, teaming up with the queen, and he tries to go for one last gasp, but the computer gets all the way to this position and is one move away from getting mated. But check, and if you sacrifice the queen here, hoping that I take it, and I allow checkmate, no, there's check. And after king g7, you have check, and you hit this and this. You're also obviously going to take the queen. You could probably do that in either order. You can take, maybe give a check, forcing the king to move into a target range, and then do this. Or pick up this pawn, where that will no longer be checkmate. So, knight takes f7, and Garry Kasparov resigned after king g7, knight g5, and rook takes h7. He resigned because after this, it looks like maybe you have a chance of surviving, but you don't, because I just take. This is no longer mate. The threat is this, the threat is this, the threat is this. It's game over. And the machine struck first, taking a 1-0 lead in the match of 1996. But let's go to the second game. In this game, and we're not going to look at this whole game because it's 73 moves long, in this game, Gary employed a strategy of long-term play. And you'll notice that he plays a reverse Grunfeld, which is actually funny. He plays this opening with the black pieces, but now he plays it a tempo up with white. c4, dc4, knight e5. And basically, after the first 10 moves, we have this, where black is a pawn up, but extremely passive. This knight bind is very strong. This bishop on g2 laser beams the board. This bishop is going to come out. The rooks are coming out here. Not to the same square, but the d1 and c1. And black is really kind of suffering here. So, queen takes b7, right? Gary kind of begins mobilizing into the position. He was a pawn up, but now he gets it back. Knight e5, and kind of an interesting middle game position. Objectively speaking, if you plug this into any modern day engine, it just says equal. But Gary focused on the long-term strategic play. So, not too much happens in this game for a while. Gary sacrifices the b pawn for the bishop and damages the position of black's kingside, just like we saw last game. So black is a pawn up, but white has infiltration on the light squares. This bishop is going to get to d5 or e4 and stand completely unopposed, and that's kind of exactly what Gary does. The computer then begins to give away a pawn to try to get some sort of activity with this bishop on c3, right? But queen takes b8, bishop e4, and now you will slowly see Gary shuffling, taking... Again, the computer was willing to sacrifice material for play, which, you know, even is common nowadays. And now Gary takes it down to an endgame. You would think, why would he do this? Queen, bishop 4, queen, bishop 4. I mean, hey, I heard in some YouTube video that opposite-colored bishops are a draw. Opposite-colored bishops are a draw, but under very specific circumstances. Opposite-colored bishops greatly favor the attacking side, because if you're attacking, the enemy bishop cannot defend against your bishop. And that's what Gary did. He slowly pried away the computer's defenses, looking for an opening. And finally, the computer decided, you know, it was just unable to guard the pawn, so it sacrificed the pawn. But Gary created the outside passer, right? Slowly. I would love to analyze every one of these moves one by one, but instead I'll tell you that you're amazing. And Gary slowly pried away the computer's defenses, got that second pawn, and some short while later, traded, and this position is just winning for white, because now the pawn will never promote. Your king and 3 pawns will walk together to the promised land. And Gary struck back for humanity's sake, and now the match is 1-1. The next 2 games of the match ended in draws. In the 5th game, Gary offered a draw to the deep blue team on move 23. He had the black pieces, and they actually declined the draw and ultimately were outplayed, which takes us to the final game of the match. Gary has a 1-game lead. Deep Blue's got the black pieces, and let's see if the team of Deep Blue can strike back and let the machine prevail. So Gary begins with knight f3, and now we have a Queen's Gambit transposition. We have a Slav defense, although this is actually nowadays known as a triangle defense, And Gary plays a very non-standard move. To the untrained eye, this just looks dumb. Why would you block in your dark squared bishop? Why is your knight so passive? Why would you not just put the knight here? But knight d2 is a move. It reinforces the center, and it basically says, hey, let's just play a slow game. Let's just play a slow game, you know? Computer already spends 2 tempi moving its c-pawn, but it's kind of arguing, hey, this knight is kind of dumb, so I can do this. Gary invites a central pawn trade, finishes this development, castles his king. Now the computer tries to fight, right? Jumping in with the knight, but Gary just sidesteps, brings the bishop back to f1. B1, I apologize. Rook e1 was designed to keep this open, but Gary plays back to b1 to laser beam this to h7. The knight can jump in, but it no longer really threatens anything. So we have bishop to d6. And this is basically what Gary did. His whole strategy this match was plant pieces on comfortable squares, not overextend, and let the computer self-destruct, right? Because the computer had a good openings base, but it had very poor strategic planning. It was very materialistic. And rook c8, takes, knight f3. Computer plays bishop before attacking the rook. Gary moves the rook up. Rook d8, h4. You would think, oh, here comes Gary, the crazy, fearsome attacker. No, actually not at all. Gary's advancing on both sides of the board. a3, b4. When you and I push 3 pawns on opposite sides of the board, we look stupid. When Gary does it, you know, he's trying to defeat a computer. Bishop c7, and now c5. More spatial dominance. All these pawns. At this point, black's only space is right here, just in the center. White is absolutely clamping down. So rook to e8, queen to d3 threatens mate, but Gary's not interested in mate. He's just slowly playing the position. Look at this. He makes a forward move threatening mate, and then he drops the rook back 1 square. Then he moves the bishop. Computer plays h5, stopping the kingside initiative. Gary says, all right, b5, I'll play on this side of the board instead. Bishop d2. You know, you got all these pawns on light squares. Those dark squares around the king look pretty juicy. But I'm going to keep playing on that side. I'm going to keep pushing. I'm going to keep pushing. And the computer's just running out of breathing room. Computer's just absolutely dominated. Oh, bishop c2, Gary slowly improving. Knight to c6, bishop to a4. Using your one forward mobilizing move against you, now I've pinned you. Oh, we have rook e7, bishop c3. And now finally, the computer tries to go for some sort of tactic. Queen is hanging and Gary says, nah, let me just take that. You could take my bishop, knight d4. Look at this bind you're in. You have no moves. And, well, you have no moves. Queen d7, bishop back to d2. Bishop to g5. Rook c8. Bishop f6. And now, finally, Gary Kasparov throws in a little tactical flair, c6. That pawn can be taken, but my queen jumps into c5. And in this position, the deep blue team resigned. Despite having a ton of pieces on the board, this was absolute suffocation. Frankly speaking, this was embarrassment. This was the equivalent of what Khabib Nurmagomedov does to some of his opponents when he fights in the octagon. Just absolute total domination from start to finish. You know, you're not supposed to put pawns on dark squares when you have a dark squared bishop. Gary completely violated that principle because look at what the computer did with its pawns. Every pawn on a light square. So that means that the dark squares are completely counterbalanced by Gary. I mean, this is crazy. And so Gary wins the 1996 match 4-2, and humanity prevails. But don't